On a misty morning in early 1942 over the Solomon Islands, a fleet of B-17 flying fortresses was conducting an attack strictly by the military book. At 20,000 feet, the golden altitude and training manuals, American pilots confidently aimed at Japanese destroyers cutting through the waves below. Their secret weapon was the Norden bombsight, a device so mythologized that it was rumored to be able to drop a bomb into a pickle barrel from miles away. Every mathematical calculation for drift and wind was complete. The 500-pound bombs left the bays, screaming through the clouds. The crews held their breath, expecting a world-shaking explosion. However, the result was a resounding zero. White plumes of water erupted hundreds of yards away from the targets. The Japanese destroyers didn't even bother to break their tactical formation. Their seasoned captain simply watched the bomb trajectories, ordered a sharp turn, and neutralized the entire American effort. It was a true humiliation for the U.S. Army Air Forces. Despite spending millions of dollars on the theory of high-altitude precision bombing, the reality in the Southwest Pacific proved the opposite. Pilots returned to New Guinea exhausted and enraged, while the Japanese Tokyo Express ships continued to ferry supplies to the jungle fronts without a single scratch on their paint. Amidst this deadlock, General George Kenney arrived to take command. Kenney was not the type of general who cared for hollow theories or polished badges. With a rugged appearance and blunt way of speaking, he looked more like a master mechanic than a high-ranking officer. Kenney looked directly at the dire situation. Maintenance crews had to scavenge scrap metal to keep planes flying, pilots were demoralized by ineffective tactics, and the Japanese Navy was running circles around them. He immediately tossed the high-altitude bombing reports into the trash. Kenney famously compared trying to hit a moving destroyer from 20,000 feet to standing on top of a skyscraper and trying to drop a marble into a coffee cup being pulled by a sprinting cat. He understood that with a 1-minute bomb fall time, a Japanese captain had more than enough time to move his ship out of harm's way. To win, Kenney knew he had to bring the planes down to the deck, right into the enemy's face. Kenney didn't want to use ordinary machine guns that would merely scratch the steel hull of a warship. He needed heavy firepower, something that could tear through a boiler room. His eyes settled on the B-25 Mitchell, a rugged, medium bomber, and the standard Army 75mm field gun. Mounting a 1,000-pound cannon, originally designed for 30-ton Sherman tanks, onto the nose of an aluminum airplane was considered insane. Engineers at North American Aviation immediately protested. They calculated that the violent recoil would rip the airframe apart, shatter the cockpit glass, and potentially knock the pilot unconscious or cause the plane to stall and fall from the sky like a rock. A barrage of technical reports filled with bright red ink was sent to Kenney, warning of structural catastrophe. They advised him to stick to the bombs and machine guns the aircraft was actually designed to carry. Ignoring the warnings, Kenney chose the reality of the battlefield over the numbers on blueprints. He gave a simple order: throw away the manual. He demanded the removal of the glass nose, the installation of a solid metal nose to absorb the force, and a cockpit redesign so a cannoneer could manually load shells amidst violent turbulence. Kenney believed the B-25 was tougher than its designers imagined. He bet his career and his pilots' lives on a high-stakes technical revolution. Ultimately, the engineers relented and built the B-25G prototype. In the eyes of the experts, it was a Frankenstein's monster that violated every rule of aeronautical design. Meanwhile, pilots whispered rumors of a flying artillery that might fly backward if they pulled the trigger. Fear and skepticism hung heavy, but the monster was ready to fundamentally change the face of naval warfare. To the pilots, this project sounded like a twisted rumor. They whispered about an aircraft carrying the firepower of a tank and joked that the recoil would send the plane flying backward. But behind the laughter was a visceral fear. They were being asked to dive straight into the dense anti-aircraft fire of a destroyer to fire a weapon that could potentially tear their own wings off. General Kenny did not wait for perfection, he needed the weapon immediately. At the North American Aviation Plant, the atmosphere turned into one of chaotic urgency. The sleek glass noses were mercilessly chopped off, replaced by heavy steel supports bolted into the fuselage. The inherent aerodynamic balance was completely destroyed. To prevent the aircraft from tipping onto its nose while parked, they had to stuff hundreds of pounds of lead into the tail. The result was an ugly, lumbering machine that handled as heavily as a Mack truck. This transformation did not take place in a clean laboratory, but in the sweltering hangars of Townsville and Port Moresby. Mechanics worked like back-alley chop shop crew, stripping away the glass skin to replace it with a cramped metal snout. Inside that snout sat the massive M4 cannon, positioned so close that the pilot could practically reach out and touch the breech. The heart of the system was a complex hydraulic recoil mechanism, the only thing standing between the pilot and a broken neck against the 21-inch kick of the barrel. To make room for this beast, the navigator's station and the bombardier's position were wiped out. In their place was a harsh new role, the cannoneer. The cannoneer had to be a man of pure brawn, standing in a narrow aluminum tunnel right next to the pilot's knee to wrestle with 15-pound shells. No machinery, no robots, just manual human power loading shells amidst the roar of the engines and the pungent smell of hot grease. He had to shove the shells in, slam the breech shut, and brace himself against the bulkhead as the cannon erupted right next to his head. The new model, nicknamed the Little Monster, was so nose-heavy it vibrated violently under the pressure of the gun. The day of the first live-fire test was Kenny's do-or-die gamble. The aircraft struggled to lift itself off the runway, heading toward a deserted coral reef. Inside the cockpit, tension reached a breaking point. The cannoneer loaded a shell, and the pilot aligned the target through crude iron sights. When the trigger was pulled, a bone-shaking shock occurred. The B-25 felt as if it had slammed into a brick wall, its forward momentum stalled for a split second. Acrid white gun smoke filled the space, and a sharp explosion rattled the very teeth of the crew. But when the smoke cleared, a miracle appeared. The wings were still intact, the engines were still humming, and the reef below had been pulverized into dust. The California engineers were wrong. You could put a cannon in the sky, if you were crazy enough to fly it. This achievement forced the 405th Bomb Squadron, the Green Dragons, to rewrite the entire flight manual. Instead of flying level to drop bombs, they now had to fight like fighter pilots. Since the cannon was fixed in place, to aim the gun, they had to aim the entire airplane. Pilots had to perform direct dives at the target, ignoring retaliatory fire, holding the nose steady until they reached suicide distance, only about 800 to 1,000 yards, close enough to see every rivet on the enemy ship. It was a high-stakes game of chicken at 200 miles per hour, where every attack was a rhythm of life and death: dive, stabilize, fire, reload, repeat. The pilots began to adjust to a grueling new tactical rhythm: dive, stabilize the airframe, fire, withstand the recoil, reload, and fire again. This was not a typical spray-and-pray machine gun run. The B-25G was now a massive sniper rifle. Due to the slow rate of fire, the crew could only get off a maximum of 3 to 4 rounds during a single pass, and only if the cannoneer was fast enough and didn't black out from the G-forces. In the cockpit, coordination functioned like a well-oiled machine. The pilot focused on steering, the co-pilot managed the engines and called out the distance, while the cannoneer became the heartbeat of the rhythm: load, lock, clear, fire. They practiced relentlessly until their hands bled and the cockpit floor was awash in heavy brass shell casings. Instead of large warships, the little monsters' first targets were Japanese barges and coastal supply boats. With these wooden or thin-skinned steel vessels, standard bombs often punched straight through the hull without exploding. However, the 75mm shells were a different story. In an engagement near La, the first round caused a barge to completely evaporate the moment it struck the target. News of the suicide coffin turning into a flying sledgehammer spread rapidly. Pilots excitedly gave their planes aggressive names like ominous 7 Bang or Sunday Punch. They also added 4.50 caliber machine guns to the nose to create a storm of lead to suppress enemy decks before delivering the knockout blow with the cannon. This was the Commerce Killer configuration, a weapon system purpose-built for hunting ships. The real challenge was the Tokyo Express. These 300-foot Japanese destroyers, bristling with anti-aircraft fire and manned by elite crews, had long looked down on low-level American bombers. They believed their speed and curtain of fire made them invincible. In late 1942, a fast transport convoy led by the destroyer Amatsukaze steamed toward New Guinea. They had no idea that B-25s carrying tank guns were waiting. Major Edens led the squadron in under low cloud cover, a perfect layer of camouflage. When the convoy appeared on the horizon, instead of climbing high or opening bomb bays, the B-25s dropped down to the crests of the waves, flying just 50 feet above the water. They were flying straight into the mouth of the tiger at 300 feet per second. With a relative closing speed of nearly 400 miles per hour, it was a game of who blinks first between aluminum and steel. From the bridge of the Amatsukaze, the Japanese captain observed and deduced that this was a standard torpedo attack. Following textbook doctrine, he ordered the ship to turn its bow toward the aircraft to narrow the target profile. But he was wrong. The B-25 did not veer toward the flank, it lunged head-on at the bow like a hawk diving on its prey. This was madness, as the American pilot was exposing himself directly to the 5-inch main gun and the ship's automatic cannons. Inside the cockpit, the pilot's world was reduced to the iron ring of his sight. He had to fight the instinct to dodge, keeping the plane absolutely steady as tracer rounds streaked past the canopy. Because the cannon was bolted to the floor, he was the only guidance system. He had to trust in mathematics and his own raw courage. Amidst the thick net of tracer fire, the American pilot knew exactly how fragile his aluminum skin was. A single hit from the destroyer's main battery would turn the plane into a cloud of debris instantly. But he could not swerve. With the 75mm cannon bolted to the floor, the pilot had to transform the entire aircraft into a living guidance system. He was the targeting brain, betting his life on physics calculations and nerves of steel. At 1,200 yards, the pilot pulled the trigger for the first time. Not for the main cannon, but for the 4.50 caliber machine guns in the nose. The roar was like a jackhammer tearing through space, spitting out 50 rounds per second. The stream of incendiary tracers swept across the water like a giant chainsaw, heading straight for the Japanese ship's bridge. The goal wasn't to sink the ship yet, but to blind it. The rain of lead shattered bridge windows and forced Japanese anti-aircraft gunners to abandon their posts for cover. The defensive fire stuttered, a life-or-death opening. The destroyer now filled his entire vision like a gray mountain of steel. 800 yards, then 700 yards. The cannoneer tapped his shoulder, shells up. The pilot held his breath, lifting the nose by a tiny fraction of a degree, aiming directly at the waterline beneath the enemy's forward turret. Boom! The 75mm cannon roared. The entire B-25 jerked as if it had slammed into a wall. The violent recoil sent dust on the floor flying, and the pungent smell of gunpowder filled the cockpit. For a moment, the pilot was blinded by the massive cloud of white smoke from the muzzle, but the 15-pound shell had already streaked away at 2,000 feet per second. The shell didn't skip on the water, nor did it ricochet off the armor. It punched through the destroyer's steel hull like it was wet cardboard. With a delayed action fuse, it penetrated deep into the engine room before detonating, shredding steam pipes and turning the ship's interior into a mess of shrapnel. On the Amatsukaze, Japanese officers reeled from the shock. They didn't understand what had hit them, a torpedo with no wake. A mine in deep water. They never suspected they were being shelled by an airplane. While the pilot pulled back on the stick to break away, the cannoneer struggled against G-forces to load the next round. He lunged forward, shoving the heavy brass casing into the breech and shouting, "Ready." The pilot banked for a second attack run, this time aiming for the stern to take out the propulsion system. The second shot detonated the depth charge racks, creating a massive fireball that blew debris high into the air. The proud Amatsukaze was now paralyzed, shrouded in black smoke and beginning to list. Other planes in the squadron swarmed in like vultures, using skip bombing techniques to deliver the final lethal blows. The warship that once dominated the South Pacific slowly sank into the depths. It didn't fall to a battleship or a submarine, but to modified bombers that experts had once deemed junk. When the squadron returned to Port Moresby, the B-25s were no longer pristine. The noses were blackened by muzzle blast, and the paint was scorched by the heat. The cockpit floors were littered with heavy brass casings that rolled around with a metallic clang like church bells. The crews climbed out with trembling legs and ringing ears, but their eyes burned with a new kind of faith. They had just rewritten the laws of physics and shifted the entire course of the war. From then on, surface warships were no longer the kings of the ocean. They could be hunted and destroyed by a single aircraft carrying a tank gun. General Kenny watched the gun camera footage, the massive splashes and the sight of the enemy ship being torn apart, and wore a look of total satisfaction. He had won a gamble of honor with the craziest idea in aerial history. The photos of the burning Amatsukaze were quickly sent to be developed, marking the birth of a new era, the era of the flying can openers. The story of the 75mm-equipped B-25 is not just a military feat, it is a classic lesson in innovation. Challenge old standards. When textbooks and high-altitude math became useless in the face of reality, General Kenny dared to throw them away. Don't let outdated processes stifle solutions for new problems. Innovate with existing resources. Instead of waiting for a lab-built superweapon, Kenny combined unrelated things, a bomber and a tank gun. Creativity is often just rearranging what you already have in a crazier way. Act based on results, not theory. Despite engineers' warning of failure, Kenny trusted the reality of combat. The lesson: step out of the air-conditioned office and face the salt spray and gun smoke of reality to find the true answer. What do you think about General Kenny's throw away the manual spirit? One crazy decision can change history, and so can your creativity. Like the video if you found this story inspiring. Comment to share your view. If you were Kenny, would you have dared to bet your pilots' lives on that cannon? Share now so your friends can learn about the little monster, B-25G, the legend that broke every rule of aviation. Especially, don't forget to hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next dramatic historical tales and deep mindset lessons. Thank you for joining the channel.